I have no idea what to say. There's no hook, there's no music. This is unlike any of my other videos. This video right here is a serious attempt at decolonization. So for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I ask you to put away any and every distraction you have around you and focus up. You're going to feel like you're going to have to watch this multiple times to actually understand it, but it's going to blow your mind away every time, like it blew mine away, inshallah. And this full of hyper condensed information, but I had no other choice. I had to make it like this. I couldn't make it in different parts. That's why you see it super long, despite me making it hyper condensed information and stuff like that as well. So again, focus up and pay attention. This is easily the deepest video I've ever made, and might just be the deepest video I will ever make. There's a new crisis that the Muslim world is dealing with. That being a lack of inspiration in Islam. Think about it. We're the highest in number we've ever been, 1.7 billion, and yet all the Muslim states are broken up, colonized, destabilized, and economically enslaved to the Western states, while experiencing unimaginable destruction to the Ummah with the end of the Caliphate and the occupation of Palestine. You'd think that we're in emergency mode, facing annihilation, and surely the Muslims are working together sleeplessly and relentlessly in this make or break situation. Yet they can't do a single thing about this situation except post on social media and talk about it in conversation over a campfire and barbecue. The greatest number ever in history, yet the weakest in power ever in history, finding no way to change this fate. But the worst part of all of this is the torchbearers of Islam, the next generation, the one where all the hopes of the Muslimin are supposed to be centered around, are nowhere to be found. The masajid lay bare with a handful of elder members here and there, but where are the youth? This is the primary concern of this video. Not as to why the Muslims are in such a dire state to begin with, colonialism is a whole nother topic, but why is the next generation absent in such a crucial moment? And trust me, you have no idea how deep this dilemma goes. If there was one principle that could summarize the crisis with the Muslim youth, it's lack of inspiration. The youth who actually care and learn about this deen understand more than anyone how many are the Muslims in their schools and how few are those that uphold that title. There's a wave of young Muslims that may unapologetically identify as Muslim, yet they're cursing all the time, they're flirting with the opposite gender, getting into haram relationships, they're doing drugs and every other haram under the sun. It's not simply out of ignorance or lack of knowledge. You can't say they don't know any better. They know what they're doing is haram, yet they don't care. So this phenomena of the youth going astray is not from a lack of knowledge as much as it is from lack of inspiration. Lack of seeing that knowledge as relevant to them. A lack of confidence to Islam being the truth, the solution for all of mankind's problems, and the only way towards a fulfilling life. But why? Why is this lack of inspiration here in the first place? This isn't something that existed throughout history. This is something recent, something new, invented even. What you'll begin to understand throughout this video is that the problem is the manner in which these youth learned about Islam to begin with, and what they perceive Islam to be. Recall your life when you opened the textbooks and you saw the history of ancient Hinduism, then the history of ancient Greece and the history of ancient Rome, but muddled in there somewhere was a section on Islamic history. Interesting placement. What about when you saw those popular interfaith panels of Islamic scholars, Christian scholars, and Jewish scholars all talking about how many similarities they have, avoiding words like truth, righteousness, and falsehood, lest they offend any of the other hundreds of religions out there? Or here's a good one. When you went for the Eid prayer and you saw time allotted on the minbar for the speech by the Imam, then time allotted for the political representatives, then the ethnic minorities and activists getting their time on the minbar of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well. There is an assumption that is underlying all of these scenarios, a common thread tying them together. That thread being secularism, that all religions are the same, and Islam is no different. That's why you saw it placed in the textbook where it was. That's why you saw Islam standing on a panel with other religions, portrayed to be just as true as any other religion. That's why you saw even the sanctity of the minbar violated with the presence of anti-Islamic sentiments and assumptions for the whole Muslim community to hear during the two greatest days of the year, the Eidain. Islam is muddled within the secular definition of what is religion. Muslims pray, So does every other religion. Muslims fast in Ramadan, Christians fast 40 days before Easter. Muslims have Jum'ah, Christians have Sunday. Islam will give you a guide for life? Why not Stoicism? I bet Buddhism will give you a better guide for life. This is the reality underpinning the lack of inspiration with the youth. A secularization of Islam into simple rituals of worship, no different than any other religion. You are all one and the same. You are all coping mechanisms to make yourself feel better at home, but irrelevant in real life. Focus on yourself. Focus on your prayers. Focus on your fasting. Mind your own business. Leave your Islam at home and in the mosques. When you step outside, you're a citizen of the state. You don't talk about religion and politics here. You need to fix yourself before talking about such grandiose ideas. Don't bring your beliefs in public, in school, at work, or any of these other places. And yet, it is precisely these places that the Muslim youth have their faith challenged. They're confronted at school by atheists that bring up radical concept of evolution, claiming it disproves Islam. They're confronted with the social justice warriors that call Islam patriarchal and oppressive to women. They're confronted with nihilists that question their belief in morality. So what's the natural consequence when the Muslim community themselves water down Islam into simple rituals as one of many religions? Just keep focusing on yourself, whilst their identity is targeted and challenged every which way. Not to mention, teenagers are often already going through an identity crisis to begin with when they start high school and university. They are primed for ideological attacks. It's a recipe for destruction. Destruction that is further amplified with speakers and community leaders that command and complain one after another. The youth don't come to Fajr. The youth aren't fasting. The youth aren't practicing. Everybody watching probably thinks I'm talking about someone they know in their community, which just goes to show how deep this secular rhetoric, intentionally manufactured by the West in their colonial project, has been carefully injected into the Muslim communities to keep them colonized. This is the real reason for the youth turning away. And then the few youth that do practice are taught a secularized version of Islam, of simply praying and memorizing your Quran. There's no drive, no vision, no inspiration. Even though Islam teaches that inspiration should precede the command, not the other way around. And it will be proven later in this video that desecularizing Islam will bring back that lost inspiration. Islam is known to create revolutionaries, whereas modern society is known to create subservient slaves. Islam creates highly motivated people talking about grandiose plans and visions with great optimism constantly taught to us by the Prophet ﷺ with unparalleled intellect and discipline. While modern society creates people that are constantly distracted, relentlessly scrolling, chained to their phones, stuck in a genjutsu of listening to secularist idols that tell them to focus on themselves. Then when they build some character, society destroys it again, and they gather their broken pieces and try to fix themselves again because their secularist idols told them to, falling into regret after all of that time wasted, leading to cycles of intense depression. This is the reality between Islam and modern society. They're polar opposites, and yet too many of us have preferred modern society. This might be an awakening for you, and you might be asking yourself, how could we fall for something so dangerous at every turn? Well, its dangers aren't so obvious to those that aren't critical thinkers. Secularism has a very pleasant slogan and a very powerful claim. It's an ideology that claims to be neutral, allowing all religions to coexist peacefully for the first time in history. An ideology that champions the grandiose claims of freeing humanity of its barbaric past of religious violence. Gone are the days of jihad, gone are the days of crusades. We're in a new era of peace thanks to secularism. Sounds beautiful, doesn't it? But we must ask ourselves, is secularism neutral? Has secularism freed us of the religious violence? And what will become increasingly more apparent is that not only are these claims false, but that secularism is far more sinister and parasitic than we could have ever imagined. This video will completely shatter your perspective on how colonization works. You will come to realize that the real threat was never foreign subjugation or political domination. It was all a battle of ideologies. That's where the real power lies. We're about to venture into the reality of secularism, what I like to call the heartbeat of the New World Order, the greatest weapon of the elites to justify their crimes, and the stealthiest of threats against Islam. You've probably learned in school that secularism is simply the separation of church and state, that after a millennium of brutal rule by the religious church that kept Europe in the Dark Ages, an era so brutal and lifeless that some historians would even question whether it actually existed, was followed by a revolution to separate church from state, which led to the progress of the Renaissance. Secularism freed the people from the tyranny of the church, and now secularism continues to give people the freedom to practice their religion, whether you're a Christian, a Buddhist, or even a Muslim. Secularism is neutral and allows all religions to live amongst each other without the barbaric religious wars and fights of the past. Secularism has come to save the day and give all religions a neutral space to live and be practiced. This is the narrative that we've been taught, unfortunately, again and again in our schools and curriculums, and this narrative could not be further from the truth. Secularism did not cause the progress of the Renaissance, and if you haven't heard the classical narrative of secularism causing scientific progress being debunked, then check out my short video clarifying that claim, because the reality is that Islam saved Europe from its dark ages, not secularism. The most important claim to note is that secularism is neutral and allows religions to coexist without the barbaric fights of the past. This is a beautiful lie. Secularism is not a neutral ideology that allows all religions to be practiced and live peacefully among one another. Secularism simply shifted the violence that used to be holy wars and religious fights to a new type of violence which claims to operate under the guise of freedom. For example, take this clip of former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
What is it that allows for the killing of 500,000 innocent Iraqi children to be justified? But if you try to save children by preventing abortion, this is labeled violent and an invasion of personal freedom. What allows for such ridiculous guidelines on what is right and what is wrong? This is justified because the secular state has no holy scripture. There is no objective morality. They govern themselves. They justify themselves. They're judge, jury, and executioner. Literally, they answer to no one. So you see these secular states commit genocide, massacres, nuclear bombing innocent civilians, and call it legitimate. There is no God. There is no scripture. There is no objective morality. So nobody's gonna hold them accountable. They can do war crimes upon war crimes with no accountability. But religious violence such as jihad, this is illegitimate. Why? Because it's religiously motivated. And the last thing that secular states want to see is religious violence, because they have PTSD from the Dark Ages. Secularism literally came to take down religion and religious violence. So any notion of that brings up this traumatic response, saying, no, one death due to religious violence is worse than 1,000,000 deaths due to non-religious violence. That's the message they give when they go around slaughtering innocent civilians while claiming to allow religious freedom. In fact, secular violence goes way beyond just the physical slaughters. You have ideological violence, such as defining what is religion and what isn't religion. Take for example Greece. Prior to joining the European Union in 1981, the citizens had their religion stamped on their identity cards. You would have your name and your religion as well. This was obviously against the European Union's laws, and so they ordered for it to be removed. The people in Greece protested, saying this is religious violence, that they would be giving up their religious rights and identities for something like this. To no surprise, Greece actually went through with the conditions anyways, and justified it, saying this is not offensive to the Orthodox Church. Wait a second. Who gave the state the power to say what is and isn't offensive to the church? The church should be doing that. But it's precisely this power that repeatedly comes into play all around the world. The secular state is constantly defining what is religion and isn't religion according to its own standards. So secular violence is still religiously motivated violence. The only difference is that they claim it to be in the interests of the state. 500,000 innocent Iraqi children died. It was worth it. Why? Because the state said so. Secularism is not an ideology that separates religion and state, but it's an ideology that worships the state. The state is the new God. The state determines what is right and what is wrong, what is halal and what is haram. And the state constantly and violently redefines religion to fit its own tastes. So secularism is not the separation of church and state, but a violent colonization of church by the state. This is the real definition of secularism. You must make it a duty and mission to do away with the notion that secularism is neutral and let the world know its violence. It is of utmost importance that these two tasks are taken up by the masses to save the youth, because this will wake them up to the chaos around them. Again, redefine secularism to its true definition and prove its violence. Only then can we fight against it. Okay, so if you're not convinced that the sweet sugar-coated slogans of secularism claiming to free humanity of violence would be enough to colonize the Muslim minds, then you're right. It was nowhere near enough. The colonization of the Muslim world is a long and heartbreaking topic, but it's not the subject of our concern as of now. Instead, we will take a simple case study of Egypt, and more specifically what many consider one of the greatest Islamic universities in Muslim history, Al-Azhar. The great tale of Egypt's secularization, and what I like to call in contemporary Islamic history as the Al-Azhar reformist arc. What many aren't aware of is the hijacking of Al-Azhar by Napoleon Bonaparte and the Satan-worshipping cult that followed. In 1798, Napoleon successfully established an administration in Al-Azhar University through force. The scholars were faced with two options: either accept and obey the French occupation, hoping the people would receive mercy and the damages are lessened, or to fight back and resist. They opted for both, an immediate surrender to the occupation whilst planning a secret revolt for the future. The news spread throughout the Muslim world, and the Imams in Mecca and Medina incited their people to fight for the liberation of Egypt. The Muslimin, united under a caliphate, were able to respond swiftly. Napoleon was soon faced with hundreds of mujahideen fighting French occupation in southern Egypt, startling him. As a last-ditch attempt to suppress the revolution, Napoleon decided to make an example of the young scholars that protested. 13 executions followed that day, but the civil unrest only got worse. In a frantic mess, Napoleon scrapped as much wealth as he could and retreated back to France. He left Muhammad Ali Pasha as his successor in this power vacuum, first of many Freemasons to become the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar. His rise to power consisted of him throwing a party to the Mamluk troops that were an obstacle to his rule. The troops were invited and came to celebrate the momentous occasion of the birth of Ali Pasha's child, only to be surrounded and slaughtered in a merciless bloodbath. Egypt was taken over by Muhammad Ali Pasha and removed itself from Ottoman rule. A series of reformations took place within Egypt's legal system, educational system, and economic system, not to mention the social reformation taking place since 1826. The first batch of Azhari students would be sent to Paris for a secular education in the sciences, only to return 5 years later with a completely manufactured and indoctrinated worldview that purged any and all Islamic concepts out. These secular agents of France, such as 𝗟𝗘𝗡𝗘𝗧'𝗦 for example, were given positions of authority to open schools, such as the School of Translators in 1835, noted for translating French works into Arabic, so the rest of the Muslims over there could also be indoctrinated into loving this secular and modern way of life. This became part of what many know as the nearly century-long Nahdla movement, fabricated by the West, to reform the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim Ummah as a whole. This is where you enter the Tanzimat reforms, the constitutionalization of the Ottoman Empire, and the liberalization of the Muslim youth, leading to the Young Turk Revolution and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, broken up into many pieces and sold across for the Western powers to feast on with no remorse. This entire project found many roots in Egypt. This is where the Satan worshippers reigned supreme. A lodge by the name of 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦 would become the base for a series of Freemason scholars, judges, and Grand Muftis, Muhammad Ali Pasha being the first, and others such as Muhammad Abdu, Jamaluddin Afghani, and Rashid Rida quickly following suit. Muhammad Abdu specifically is noted for his influence in Al-Azhar while he was the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar. He wrote his great fantasies of how every time he's among the Muslims in Egypt, his heart decays and his dreams dry up. But a quick vacation to Europe renews his iman after seeing their superior culture and way of life. Yes, this is the Grand Mufti of what you imagine to be one of the greatest Islamic universities. He's writing this stuff in his journals. Yet this inferiority complex does not compare to what his students would go on to portray. Just to name a few, Qasim Amin, a judge of Egypt, writing books such as 1901 The New Woman, on how the women in the West are independent and free, while the women in the Muslim world are chained and oppressed. He also advocated for the banning of niqab. Another was Sheikh Ali Abdul Raziq, graduate and professor at Al-Azhar. He wrote openly and unapologetically that secularism has come to free the Muslims and the caliphate is an un-Islamic institution. a statement that called into question whether or not he was Muslim. To no surprise, he was banished from Al-Azhar for such views. Rashid Rida, a Freemason just like his contemporaries and teachers, played the role of a spokesperson, spreading the teachings of Muhammad Abdu far and wide in his popular journal Al-Manar, named after the infamous Tafsir Al-Manar of his teacher. Though some would like to point out his dissection of modernity, rejection of Freemasonry, and his refutation of his teacher Muhammad Abdu, they usually point this out without telling you at which stage of his life he took this position. It was near the end, after all the damage had already been done. Dr. 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦, under the reign of 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦, he was able to completely secularize Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar was no longer an Islamic university alone. It had the engineering faculty and medical faculty among many other secular faculties. These faculties also had a certain percentage you need to get in. The Islamic department, you need like a 60% or 70%. The engineering and medical department, you need a 90% and over. And so you realize this was a systematic allocation of the smarter people going into engineering and medical and the stupid people going into the Islamic department. A systematic colonization that reduced the quality of scholars. Study of Islam is categorically superior to any other secular field. When you say seek knowledge to the ends of the earth and include medicine, then you're doing a disservice to the deen. This is not saying to do away with any scientific research or secular subjects at all, but it's to show the same concept we talked about earlier, where Islam was being muddled within all these different, scholars with the different platforms and stuff like that. Again, over here you see Islam as a field muddled within the secular system. Now, this isn't to say that Al-Azhar is now a cult or is misguided. Rather, it's only accurate to conclude that it is a colonized, centralized, and secularized institute. You can go with the right paradigm and gain traditional knowledge, but only as far as the secular state sees fit, because Al-Azhar is now a secular state institution where the elite politicians determine what you're allowed to speak of and what you're not allowed to speak of, what you can have in the curriculum and what you can't. Furthermore, Al-Azhar is no longer decentralized. Their teachers and imams are civil servants, government employees hired by the state. Again, this doesn't necessitate that they are deviant or misguided. Rather, it tells us more about how much Egypt has strayed from the Sharia by systematically restructuring what it means to be a scholar, what it means to be a judge, and what it means to interpret a law. This is gonna blow your mind, so really pay attention over here. The interpreters of law, otherwise known as lawyers and judges, are now state-trained elites, not the average person on the street. Because law school is so expensive and takes so much time, it's almost always filled with the rich and elite. They all study under the same state-mandated curriculum, they all know each other because they went to that same university, they know all the politicians that fill their pockets. In fact, Al-Azhar is on record for never allowing a non-Egyptian to become the Grand Mufti of Al-Azhar, with the exception of the legendary Sheikh Muhammad 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦, who resigned after seeing the corruption around him under the reign of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Compare this corrupt secular legal system with the Sharia. Who are the interpreters of law in an Islamic society? It's not lawyers and judges, it's ulama and fuqaha. These are people that are often not from the rich and elite. They're poor, coming from harsh environments and completely different upbringings. They're not all Egyptians. These scholars are from all types of ethnicities and backgrounds. They're decentralized because they were all independently educated. They had their own shuyukh in different parts of the land. It wasn't the government that taught all of them the same black and white instructions on how to legitimize their secular state as an Islamic state that implements Sharia. And most importantly, these diverse groups of ulama and fuqaha that are decentralized were also legally and financially independent. This is absolutely important because they're not cogs in the system anymore, interpreting the law however the secular state tells them to, because the state doesn't fill their pockets anymore. Even those that got paid as qadis almost always had an independent profession for them to earn income. This is nothing like the modern nation state where the interpreters of law, aka lawyers and judges, are systematically attached to the legitimizers of law, aka the state. The Sharia makes a clear separation between them. It is precisely this centralization of power towards a certain group of elites that allows for the mass corruption of man-made laws to be implemented in every single Islamic state. Yes, that's correct. This secular legal system exists in every single country, no matter how Islamic they claim to be. It's a system that takes sovereignty away from the divine sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and gives this sovereignty to the secular state to take the sharia, twist it however they see fit, and then apply it whilst utilizing their underling scholars to give this distorted version of the sharia legitimacy. That this country that runs on capitalistic values with central banks controlling the masses through interest and debt, this country that has run amok with the justice system, completely departing from the Islamic conception of decentralizing the power between the scholars and the rulers, this country that aids foreign interests by colonizing their own citizens with the Western education system, can still claim to be an Islamic country? How is this even possible by any stretch of the means? But this is the reality you're living in. This is what neo-colonization really looks like. And it found its roots in Egypt, hijacking Al-Azhar, the head of the Muslim Ummah, and using their scholars to publish and propagate the Western systems and way of life. What you end up having is the trickling down of the secular reform into the Muslim Ummah. The masses begin to view the intellectually incompetent as sources of guidance, whilst the secular project advances deeper and deeper into the minds of the Muslims. No identity is left except that it is relabeled. No idea is left except that it is restated. No word is left except that it is redefined. If you watched my video on language, you know that very well. All of this was to fit the new paradigm, carefully curated and spoon-fed to you by the very people you thought were supposed to be knowledgeable. The guided ones, the scholars that came from these amazing Islamic universities. You must break free. You must begin reading and thinking past the assumptions that are constantly fed to you. You understand the urgency of the situation now, that the absence of youth in the masjid isn't a mishap or a coincidence. Rather, it's a result of a colonization process that took place at what was imagined to be one of the most knowledgeable and secure Islamic universities on earth, and has continued relentlessly to colonize the rest of the Muslim Ummah. What you're stepping into now is the most mind-melting part of this hegemonic program. The effects that secularism has in the minds of the Muslim masses today as a result of colonization. This will wake you up on how deep secularism sits in your own mind. You'll experience what decolonization actually feels like. I remember being on a break from work and going to a local Tim Hortons. I happened to see a group of Muslimas sitting together, and it was World Hijab Day. So I decided to go over to them and ask them, why do you wear hijab? And to no surprise, most of them answered, I chose to wear it because it protects me, proceeding to give social benefits to hijab. This isn't a wrong answer per se, but it isn't accurate either. Why wasn't the answer closer to the actual truth of, because Allah commanded me so? Would you abandon the hijab if it didn't protect you? If it didn't have these social benefits listed? Of course not. So the reason you wore it is simply because God commanded it. And yet this wasn't the primary answer. Why? Because the response that usually follows is, you're so oppressed. You're being forced to wear it because of your parents or because of your religion. It's liberal and secular value to always have the choice. Islam is all about submission, and liberalism is all about choice. They're completely at odds with one another. Liberalism tells you that you should choose to pray, you should choose to wear hijab. It's all about you and your choice and your freedom because this is your body and your life. But as a Muslim, we have no choice. It's utter submission. It's not my body, it's owned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I do obey my parents, I do adhere to my religion, regardless of my personal choice. But that secular impulse gets to us, and we begin trapping ourselves with our own responses to questions, saying it was my choice to protect myself. And of course, this by no means implies that you don't question anything as a Muslim and just turn your brain off to purely submit. Nor does it imply that people who respond with such a secular answer are deviant or misguided or anything of the sort. This example is simply to highlight how deeply the secular impulse roots itself in every single thought we have, every single belief we hold, and every single word we utter. Only a fool would be careless surrounded by something so malicious and parasitic to their iman. And you might think I'm reading between the lines, but this is the lowest of examples. Once you see the other examples that become increasingly adverse, you'll realize this is where it all started, these small signs. A more adverse example of the secular impulse is aesthetic mimicry. Imagine fashion trends in high school. You had different people expressing themselves with different aesthetics. You had the goths in one corner, the skaters in another, the nerds, the athletes. Each person will have reasons as to why they chose that aesthetic and can likely even argue for it. Similarly, when the Muslim world was attacked, destabilized, and colonized, you had Muslim scholars such as the graduates from Al-Azhar University and Qadis literally praising the Western way of life and their superior culture. They wrote a great deal of books convincing the rest of the Muslim world how backwards they are due to their Islam and how they must now keep up with the times. Thus, the Muslim world started following Western fashion trends that violated the Islamic guidelines. And just as the high schoolers explained why they chose their aesthetic, you had Muslims arguing for why they do so as well, which created room for questioning why Muslims wear what they do. Why does the hijab exist? Is it part of the Islamic tradition? Why were almost all the scholars that synthesized that tradition men? This whole Islam thing looks a little patriarchal all of a sudden. I don't think the hijab should exist. It's a tool of power for men over women. This line of thinking is the secular impulse taking form. A simple mimicry of clothing can quite easily lead to a faith crisis in a certain context when you unintentionally adopt the assumption that the Western way of life is superior to the Islamic way of life. In this case, another assumption was manufactured into this Muslim's mind, that equality is a moral right. And the absence of equal representation is signs of oppression or systematic disadvantage. It doesn't necessarily follow that this person outright claims Islam to be inferior, rather they behave in such a manner. They can claim for Islam to be the truth and yet speak of Islamic history and its achievements in ill manners, claiming that you're simply romanticizing the past. It was full of problems and oppression. We're in the modern times now. Get with the times. This is a deeply colonized mind, one that has been overtaken by the secular impulse, full of assumptions on what is the past, what is the future, what is barbaric, and what is progress, not realizing that their definitions of these terms are definitions that were intentionally manufactured to keep them enslaved, not realizing that we're living someone else's history. This conception of reality did not originate in Muslim lands. It originated in Europe under certain contexts with certain intellectual trends, certain development in technologies, and certain assumptions of what is a human being, what are his needs, and how can those needs be fulfilled. The examples of the secular impulse are too many to count. The simple existence under a secular society alone is violent to every single idea you hold dear to you. At any given point in time, your reality is intentionally being manufactured from the moment you step outside and see billboards and hear music, the moments you go to school, learning from a state-mandated curriculum that allows for all sorts of immorality and secular violence, but constantly claims religion has no place in this public school. You are never safe. You're either moving or being moved. Pick your choice carefully. And if you've chosen that it's time you stop being a pawn in someone else's board and want to regain control of reality by purging yourself of every false concept that has been fed into you ever since you were a kid, then you've come to the right place. This next chapter will wake you up to a few of the many assumptions that were manufactured into your mind. But it is only a foot in the door. Decolonization is not a pill nor a statement. It is a lengthy process, not meant for the weak-minded and faint at heart. Be warned, your very reality is being called into question. If you've watched my main video on language as a tool of colonization, which should be the first video of mine you ever watched, you understand that words quite literally shape your reality. If someone defined hamburgers as the most poisonous thing on the planet, then even at the brink of starvation, you would prefer death from hunger than that torturous substance called a hamburger. This is because what you imagine hamburger to mean has been manufactured to create a whole new reality in your mind. It is precisely this redefining of terms and what concepts they imply that leaves many people unknowingly obeying the secular world order. The two terms we're going to redefine are law and time. Stoicism, red pill, self-help industry, what do these things have in common? They're only possible to grow due to one thing, the new conception or definition of law, due to secularism. That law is something that is separate from morals. The government has nothing to do with your beliefs, prayers, and moral upbringing, but it has everything to do with the violation of rights, safety, and property. In the modern world, when you don't go to the masjid for prayer out of laziness, that's an ethical transgression or a moral transgression. You shouldn't do that because that's wrong, but who's gonna do anything about it? You might get a side eye, maybe yelled at by your parents, but that's about it. There is no legal consequences. But throughout Islamic history, you not coming to the masjid for prayer for no reason had legal consequences. Forget the obligatory prayers here for a second. Even not coming to the masjid for the sunnah prayer before Fajr would often take away your status as a witness in the court of law. There was an entire system that held your hand and walked you to the masjid. To look at the absence of people coming to the masjid and simply say these people are weak in iman and need to focus on themselves is a naive statement and an oppressive oversimplification of the phenomenon. It's a response that has its roots in liberal and secular philosophy, assuming that the human being is free and can decide his or her own fate if they so decided. But the human being is not innately free. The human being is affected by his or her circumstances. If you have a society without the Sharia legal system to incentivize showing up for Fajr, you'll evidently see less people show up. If you have a society that plays harmful and filthy music everywhere whilst allowing nude advertisements to be posted in every turn, then you will have a weakness of iman plague the population. Because the society itself is vicious towards iman. It kills it wherever it can. If nudity was banned, filthy music was made illegal or haram, and the legal system was Islamic instead of secular, then you would evidently see that society is now conducive to iman, a welcoming environment that nurtures iman in the people, allowing them to become upright and show up to the masjid for Fajr en masse. Of course, this isn't to say you shouldn't go to the masjid for Fajr, you are liable. But it's to highlight the secular response adopted by many speakers and imams, saying the problem of the ummah is you and me, the individual. That if the individual fixed itself, then the individual fixed its family, then the individual could go on and fix society. This type of thinking has left us in a cycle of suffering, a genjutsu of sorts. While you try to fix individuals and bring them back to the deen, society destroys them 10 times faster. And yet we continued with this secular rhetoric. The past 100 years are a testament to that fact. We've undoubtedly stooped lower and lower despite great efforts. Why? Because those Muslims that were given the role of leadership, the imams and the scholars of the ummah, aided the secular world order. They helped the secular politicians of the West colonize the Muslims. They embodied what Malcolm X described as the house Negro, or Uncle Tom. Here's an excerpt from one of Malcolm X's speeches. The house Negro usually lived close to his master. He dressed like his master, he wore his master's second-hand clothes, he ate food that his master left on the table, and he lived in his master's house, probably in the basement or the attic, but he still lived in the master's house. So whenever that house Negro identified himself, he always identified himself in the same sense that his master identified himself. When his master said, "We have good food," the house Negro would say, "Yes, we have plenty of good food. We have plenty of good food." When the master said that we have a fine home here, the house Negro said, "Yes, we have a fine home here." When the master would be sick, the house Negro identified himself so much with his master, he'd say, "What's the matter, boss? We sick?" His master's pain was his pain, and it hurt him more for his master to be sick than for him to be sick himself. When the house started burning down, that type of Negro would fight harder to put the master's house out than the master himself would. But then you had another Negro out in the field. The house Negro was in the minority. The masses, the field Negroes were the masses, they were in the majority. When the master got sick, they prayed that he'd die. If his house caught on fire, they'd pray for a wind to come along and fan the breeze. If someone came to the house Negro and said, "Let's go, let's separate," naturally that Uncle Tom would say, "Go where? What could I do without boss? Where would I live? How would I dress? Who would look out for me?" That's the house Negro. But if you went to the field Negro and said, "Let's go, let's separate," he wouldn't even ask you where or how. He'd say, "Yes, let's go." And that one ended right there. You will undoubtedly see this in the Muslim communities of the West when you speak of the ultimate solution for every single modern problem, not only in the Muslim community but for humanity. That ultimate solution being the establishment of the caliphate, a term hijacked by Western media to associate with ISIS and other artificial US-funded terrorist campaigns. Yet it's a term that is mentioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the Most High in the Quran, a duty that every single classical scholar in Islamic history has praised as the most important communal obligation. This is something that should keep a believer restless, whether they're in a Muslim majority country or living as a minority, all playing their part in its establishment. But speaking of this upsets Uncle Tom, because it implies separation from its master. Caliphate? Have you even mapped out how we're going to respond to a crypto boom, an AI revolution as a nation state in the 21st century? Do we even know how immigration will work with the onset of documentation and passport? Or perhaps they're even more infatuated with the secular world order, that they would immediately label those calling Islam superior to the Western way of life as a danger to the government, that their secular master helped them connect with other faiths and gave them food and security. Nobody is allowed to speak ill of their master. Separation from their master is beyond comprehension for them, for the fruits of their labor is tied to how much they appease their master. They cannot imagine being an imam without it, being a community leader without it, being a Muslim activist without it. In the mind of an Uncle Tom, these initiatives cannot thrive without the appeasement of their master. So if their master tells them to climb on the mimbar and tell the field Negroes to work harder on the fields, tells the Muslims to focus on themselves and focus on their prayers before thinking of solving the Ummah's problems, then the Uncle Tom will happily obey the state's wishes, climb on the mimbar and do so. In order to break free from this inferiority complex, we must undo this new conception of law as something separate from morals. That it's a contradiction to say, I morally disagree with you, but I support your political right to do so. We must understand that there is no separation between morals and laws. The Sharia made it law to pray and to fast, just as it made law to pay tax and obey capital punishment. They're inseparable, but separating them allows for you to have different moral paradigms while obeying the same law. That's why you can have so many social justice movements like Red Pill, feminism, Neo-Stoicism. They're all trying to fill the void of morals left by the state, because the state said, obey all these laws one after another, but guidance for life? We'll give you the freedom of determining that. Once again, undo this definition or you'll also become an Uncle Tom. The second shift is a shift in conception of time. Secularism, the murder of religion, did away with all scriptures used as constitutions. No more black and white set of rules that don't change. Everything must be questioned and changed constantly. What was haram 50 years ago can't be haram today, and what is haram today can't be haram 50 years from now. Or so the phenomenon goes. And I like to call this particular shift in the conception of time, liquidity of morals. Morals must not be consistent through time, but constantly updated and revised through time, because we're constantly learning through trial and error. This conception of time gives the modern state a godlike status, because you can't criticize it anymore. Anything that the modern state destroyed or did wrong throughout time, whether it's the environment, whether it's with crime rates, whether it's with suicide statistics, all these problems that are new to the modern era are simply temporary blocks on the road of trial and error. We're always changing after all. Just wait for the next patch update, for the next court hearing. We'll get over it somehow. Ironically, when the court hearing ends, they say the court is adjourned. Adjourned means postponed, that we will pick up where we left off next time. There is no end to it. It's always a constant postponement of a crisis, and then coming up with half-baked solutions where half the board members disagree but gets passed anyways, and then fails like it always has, just for another hearing to be promised to the public so they can shut up. This is the new conception of time, where the subjects are told time itself will grant them the solution to all problems. New problems require new moral paradigms to answer them. However, time isn't as linear as a secular state would like you to think. Time is cyclic. History repeats itself, as they say. These problems may have new characteristics, but they have the same motivation. They were created by the same being, after all. A being that has always slept and woken, ate and drank, felt fear and love, anxiety and grief, greed and generosity. The human being has never changed, so why do we assume the morals governing them must change? We're always assuming that we're always arriving at the truest way of living right now. And yet by saying that, we're also admitting that 5 to 10 years from now, our way of thinking is going to be outdated. Yet that doesn't stop us from continuing to do what we do now. The Pentagon isn't sitting with the decisions to invade Iraq saying, maybe we shouldn't do this. We'll think differently 5 to 10 years from now. No, they don't say that. This is the most true thing currently. They're going all out. This seems like insanity, but this is the truth of the secular conception of time. There is no foundation or reference except itself. Why is it good? Because it's the latest medicine, cutting edge technology, to buy the most recent phone or to engage in the most recent trend. Modern history is so self-referential that you can't even criticize it. It assumes in its concept of time that it's already the best, and if you have any problem or critique of it, it will be fixed in the next update. The fix is right around the corner. We're changing so quickly and so often after all. This is one of the first concepts that was manufactured into you. Accepting time to be linear, constantly requiring new moral paradigms instead of looking back at history for answers. Constant change of what's right and what's wrong, and always assuming we're arriving at the truest way of living right now. This concept of time has given the modern secular state a godlike status and left its subjects constantly going after the next trend, the next phone, the next goal they should have in life. You must undo these assumptions and accept time to be cyclic. Accept the human being as fundamentally unchanging, therefore morals are unchanging. Accept that what is true today must have been true 100 years ago and will be true until the end of times. Only then will you begin to break free from the cycle of constantly chasing what's new and never learning from the past. So, I know I talked about a lot of stuff in this video, and a lot of this was just like really mile-melting. You're telling yourself that, yo, I need to go back and watch this like 10 times, but I'm gonna give you a quick recap to maybe help you with that. You're still probably gonna have to rewatch it anyways. But we started with the new crisis of the Muslim world. You know, the absence of youth during the most crucial moments of the Ummah. We traced it back to the primary source, that being secularism. We investigated what this term claimed to mean and what it actually meant. And from then on, we relentlessly broke down all of its assumptions that granted it legitimacy. You now understand secularism to be a hegemonic and parasitic ideology that entered the Muslim Ummah through the mouth of the scholars, Egypt being one of many examples. And once this parasite had made its way in, it slaughtered the Islamic concepts and attempted to take the place of these Islamic concepts in the minds of the Muslims, resulting in intellectual colonization of the masses. You saw the collection of secular impulses working in tandem with one another, putting the Islamic books on the same shelf as the Christian books, the Hindu books and the Buddhist books, putting the Imam on the same stage as the rabbi and the priests, redefining politics as something full of corruption and deceit, whilst pushing the notion that to be a good human being you should refrain from speaking about politics and religion. These topics divide people, and we want to unite people, while allowing superficial diversity and inclusion in ethnicity, for example. We want Africans, Chinese, Indians, representation, yeah, in sexuality, etc. But at the same time, they'll subject everyone to the same laws, regardless of beliefs. Unlike the Sharia, where you, as 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦, for example, can have your own ruling system and stuff. It's not all the same laws. But over here, in the Western society, everything is just one law. One constitution applies to every single person, regardless of belief. Everyone in the modern nation state is programmed to think in the same manner with the same underlying metaphysical assumptions about life and what is progress, what is right, and what is wrong. But you're allowed this superficial diversity to really mask the autonomy and brainwashing happening behind the scenes. You've understood a great deal, dear viewer, but are you prepared for the consequences? In the book 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦 by 𝗟𝗘𝗡𝗡𝗡𝗘𝗖𝗧, Nasib and Muhtara are two religious characters in a secular world. They break the fourth wall and plead with the author to not include them in the book. Why? Because the people are too distant to understand them. There are too many assumptions that stand in the way to empathy, too many false concepts that stand in the way to truth, too many idols that stand in the way to God. Placing them among such people will only do more damage. So leaving them out would be an act of mercy. That's what these religious characters broke the fourth wall to plead for. The people are too far to understand us. This is what life will seem to be now for the awakened Muslim that has embarked on the path of God. You shouldn't run away like these guys and ask not to be included. This is only motivation for you to be included even more. You will face secularism wherever you turn, secularized minds in every conversation, but you must bear with patience and wisdom. You will face ridicule and mockery, accusations and rumors, perhaps even torture and pain, to the extent you might feel that you are better off excluded from this book we call life, and that perhaps God shouldn't have placed you among such distant people. But that's a very false and dangerous line of thinking. You must keep going, for nothing allows evil to flourish like silence from the truthful. Who will question these assumptions? Who will debunk these false concepts? Who will tear down these modern-day idols? You don't have a choice in the matter any longer. You will be questioned on the day of judgment for what you learned, but kept from the people. So you must go out and save people from this parasitic ideology that is latching onto us all. This is the mission of Islam. You must deconstruct the false paradigm before reconstruction of the correct one. You must declare La ilaha before you declare illallah. You must prove the Western way of life to be destructive and disastrous before you prove the Islamic way of life to be the truth, though they're inseparable. Okay, so I can understand how many people would find this video offensive, that I'm having no filter when I'm addressing the authorities of the Ummah, the scholars and the Imams, and using inappropriate examples of Malcolm X and his example of Uncle Tom. But you need to understand that this is an emotional reaction. Of course, I'm not saying that every single imam or scholar is bad or problematic or anything of the sort, but what I'm saying is the distribution curve is not even when it comes to everybody in the ummah, when it comes to blaming for the downfall of the ummah. The person who is working, 16, 17 hours just to put food on the table in a war-torn country, he's not responsible the same amount as a scholar that was well-fed, well-rested by its people, and that was given positions of power by the people. Amana that they had to fulfill, and yet they did not fulfill that. They were responsible. They had a greater responsibility. In fact, they had the utmost and the greatest responsibility at the absence of any real Muslim leaders. Most of the responsibility of damages falls on the shoulders of scholars, and most of the responsibility for repair in the future will also fall on the shoulders of scholars. We should be very skeptical of the narrative spouted in these dark times. It doesn't matter who they are. And we should fight against this modern culture that, like many other things, is a manufactured culture of always acknowledging the khair and showing utmost adab when we are speaking to those in positions of power and those scholars and imams. Citing a hadith of how the scholar is 1,000 times more virtuous than the worshipper in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, we need to uphold these scholars just like the Sahaba did. A balanced approach to calling out ideas in public and advising personalities in private. Many might also assume that I'm speaking of somebody local to their community, because a lot of this rhetoric that I actually emphasize in this video was actually very, very specific, you could say. But you need to understand the same cookie cutter rhetoric is spouted everywhere, whether it's Canada, whether it's the United States of America, whether it's the UK. All these other places have the same cookie cutter rhetoric because they all come from the same idea. They all come and are manufactured by the same secular rhetoric. The same rhetoric that says if you don't appease the secular master, then you are a threat to the government. The same rhetoric that says you're all causing division. The same rhetoric that says if you're not accredited from a state-mandated university, that if you don't have the degrees, then you should know your place and you should go ahead and seek knowledge and leave the da'wah and the community work up to those accredited people. I would never have to make these videos if those accredited people and those scholars actually upheld their end of the bargain. لِتُبَيِّنُنَّهُ لِلنَّاسِ وَلَا تَكْتُمُونَ, to absolutely clarify things for everybody and hide absolutely nothing. If they upheld this, then I would forget even making this video. I would never even have to make a YouTube account. I could go ahead and pursue my dreams of what I actually want to do. I could go ahead and become a doctor and start making movies on my own. I could spend my time reciting the Quran all day, all night, and spend great lengths in prayer without worry. But look at the ummah. When they turned to those authorities and asked them to take them to a better place, they were taken to a ditch. And I was caught in here trying to crawl out, trying to bring back the youth to the masjid, trying to bring back the ideological and non-secular understanding of Islam. This is one video where you feel like everything is heavily biased, because this is real and painful history that everybody needs to understand. I'm not calling for anybody to go ahead and stir up violence. I'm not calling for public attacks of scholars and imams or anything. I'm calling for skepticism of grand narratives and for people to be more learned and to be able to discern between different narratives that are being fed to them from different parts of the Muslim world, and to have absolute conviction of how they're going to live their life going forward. That's all there is to it. I hope you guys understand. Hey guys, so this video was actually motivated by a podcast done by the Three Muslims. It was hosting 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦. I think it was called Young Muslim Struggles in the West. Young Muslim Struggle. This was an amazing podcast and one of the most accurate diagnoses I've ever heard about Muslims in the West. And it motivated this entire documentary to come into fruition in the first place. You guys need to go and watch that. What also motivated a lot of the content in this was the discussions between Imam Tom Fachin, or Fakin, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, and Blogging Theology, Paul Williams. Oh my god, they also had some very, very intellectual discussions talking about two books, Formations of the Secular, but that was by the author 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦, very, very popular, and The Impossible State by 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦. Wow, so if you can watch these things, man, this video is only an introduction to those. And I'd appreciate it for you to like, subscribe, most importantly to share it. This is going to let the algorithm push it forward, and other people are going to experience what you guys just experienced while you were watching this video. Again, this is something that is so, so crucial, and you watching this it's not necessarily a good thing. On the Day of Judgment, you might be asked, what you did with the knowledge you had. And so I want you to teach it. This doesn't even have to be sharing this video. I want you to just go out and teach the concepts you learned over here, right? Again, you learned from the top of the beginning of this video. I didn't heavily edit any of this and stuff like that. This is very natural, just to highlight the importance of it. I'm not trying to sell you anything. And this is something that just needs to be done, or else we're not going to see any progress in the Muslim world. We're going to be locked in the constant cycle we've been locked in the past 200 years of this downward spiral. And so you need to break free. You need to start taking initiatives. All that being said, if you ever need to contact me, you can do so with Instagram or Discord. Links are in the description. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.